The wind did not just blow, it screamed. 100-mile-per-hour Arctic beast, tearing across the open steppe, swallowing the horizon in a blinding, suffocating sheet of white. Inside the tiny, isolated cabin, the temperature was plummeting. The timber groaned, bending under the immense, crushing pressure of the gale. Frost crept across the inside of the glass, jagged and sharp like cracked bone. If a single pane gave way, the brutal cold would rip through the room, freezing the blood in a matter of minutes. Yet, Clara did not cower. She stood perfectly still, her hands pressed against the vibrating wood, listening not to the storm, but to the strange, rhythmic rattling just inches outside her thin walls. A towering wall of dead flowers, standing between her and absolute destruction. To the outside world, she was just Clara, a young widow left completely alone on the unforgiving plains. They saw a woman with striking features, struggling to maintain a homestead built for the strength of two men. But Clara possessed a quiet, ancient intelligence, one born from the deep memories of the old country. When the brutal heat of late summer had begun to fade into the biting chill of autumn, the men of the neighboring settlements had busied themselves with heavy axes, chopping massive cords of thick oak and reinforcing their roofs with heavy iron ties. They watched the darkening sky with grim, hardened faces, knowing the almanacs had predicted a winter of historic, deadly violence. But Clara had done something that made them halt their heavy wagons and laugh out loud. Instead of chopping timber, she had spent the waning days of autumn meticulously tending to a massive, towering perimeter of giant sunflowers. She had driven her stiffened hands into the freezing, hardening mud, planting and dragging the thick, fibrous stalks until they directly touched the fragile exterior planks of her home. The stalks were dead, yellowed, and dry as bone. They scraped against the cabin with a hollow, eerie sound in the sharp autumn breeze. "Are you trying to make the house look pretty for the snowdrifts, Clara?" One neighbor had mocked, his thick wool coat pulled tight against the dropping temperature. "Those brittle stems will snap before the first flurry even hits the ground." They dismissed her entirely, returning to their sturdy stone fireplaces and thick log walls, entirely unaware of the primitive physics, the brilliant biological mesh she was meticulously weaving. They ridiculed her gardening, but they did not understand the true hidden power of the steppe. The transition from autumn to winter on the open steppe did not happen overnight. It arrived in subtle, cruel increments. The late October sun hung low in the sky, a pale, heatless coin that offered no comfort against the rising wind. Clara stepped out of her cabin door, her breath immediately condensing into a thick, swirling cloud of silver mist. Her lungs burned with the first, sharp inhalation. The air smelled of distant ice, a metallic, sterile scent that signaled the death of the fields. She pulled her heavy woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, her hands aching from weeks of unyielding labor. Her fingers were raw, the skin split and calloused from handling the rough, coarse fibers of the earth. Before her stood the target of her obsession, a dense, towering fortress of giant sunflowers, their once vibrant yellow heads now drooping, black, and heavy with dried seeds. The neighboring homesteaders had already retreated indoors, their chimneys belching thick, dark columns of pine smoke. They watched her through the small, frosted panes of their distant windows, shaking their heads in pity and amusement. To them, she was a mad woman wasting her remaining strength on dead vegetation. But Clara understood what they did not. She walked along the perimeter of her home, her boots crunching loudly on the brittle, frozen grass. She knelt by the base of the first row of stalks, reaching out to grasp one. It was as thick as a grown man's wrist, hardened by the summer sun and cured by the dry autumn wind. When she squeezed it, the stalk did not crush. It resisted with a surprising, stubborn resilience. The outer skin was deeply grooved, a natural corrugated armor designed by nature to withstand the punishing winds of the open plains. Phase 1 of her frantic preparation required absolute precision. She could not simply let the sunflowers stand at random. They had to be engineered into a cohesive, interlocking shield. She picked up her heavy iron hand scythe, the metal freezing to the touch even through her thick leather gloves. With a sharp, rhythmic swing, she began to harvest the outermost stalks, cutting them close to the iron-hard ground. Each strike sent a dull vibration up her arms, a jarring ache that settled deep into her shoulders. The sound of the blade slicing through the dried, fibrous tubes echoed like a gunshot in the silent, empty valley. Swish, crack, swish, crack. She worked with a desperate intensity, her heart hammering against her ribs, her body slick with sweat despite the sub-zero breeze that bit at her exposed cheeks. She gathered the cut stalks in bundles of 12, binding them tightly with coarse hemp twine. These were not mere piles of kindling. As she lifted the heavy bundles, she marveled at their unexpected properties. The dried stems were incredibly lightweight, yet their structural integrity was astonishing. Nature had packed the interior of each stalk with a dense, microscopic honeycomb of cellulose fibers. It possessed an immense tensile strength, flexible enough to bend without snapping, yet rigid enough to bear a crushing load. Clara dragged the heavy bundles toward the western wall of her cabin, the direction from which the deadliest Arctic blasts always roared. The wind was picking up now, a low, ominous hum that vibrated through the vast expanses of the steppe. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and deep amber. Time was running out, and the true work had only just begun. The next morning arrived without a dawn. The sky was a uniform, leaden gray, heavy with the suffocating weight of unfallen snow. The temperature had plunged further into the negatives, turning the moisture in the air into tiny, floating needles of frost that bit at Clara's eyes the moment she stepped outside. Phase 2 was the most grueling, delicate part of her defense. She had to affix the heavy, woven bundles of stalks directly against the cabin's exterior walls. If there was even a 3-inch gap between the wood and her biological mesh, the howling winter drafts would find it, slipping behind the shield and freezing the logs from the outside in. She stood before the western wall, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. The wind was no longer humming. It was beginning to hiss, kicking up loose, icy dust that swirled around her ankles like ghostly serpents. Using a heavy iron mallet and long, hand-forged iron spikes, Clara began the exhausting process of anchoring the framework. Every blow of the mallet against the iron spikes sent a shockwave through her frozen hands, a searing flash of pain that made her jaw clench. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was hollow, swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness of the plains. She positioned the first bundle vertically, pressing the thick, fibrous stalks flush against the rough-hewn pine logs of her home. She drove the spikes through the hemp bindings, pinning the sunflowers securely. She could feel the immense density of the stalks as the twine compressed against the wood. They formed a tight, compact mattress of plant matter, nearly 5 inches thick. Her hands were losing all sensation, turning a dangerous, pale, waxy white beneath her gloves. But she refused to stop. She worked her way along the entire length of the exposed wall, layering the bundles in a meticulous, overlapping pattern, much like the scales of a great fish. She placed the sturdiest, thickest bases at the bottom, burying them slightly into the freezing dirt, while the lighter, seed-heavy tops reached up toward the eaves of the roof. As she worked, she could hear the distant sounds of the settlement. The men were using horses to drag final logs to their woodpiles, shouting to one another over the rising wind. One rider passed along the distant ridge, slowing his horse to watch the young widow hammer dead flowers into her home. He shook his head, let out a harsh, mocking laugh that carried across the cold air, and spurred his horse away. They believed in muscle, stone, and iron. They did not see the invisible trap she was setting for the wind. By mid-afternoon, the western and northern walls were entirely encased in the pale, golden-brown armor of the sunflowers. The cabin no longer looked like a human dwelling. It looked like a strange, primeval cocoon, a rustic mound woven out of the steppe itself. Clara leaned against the corner of the house, her muscles trembling with absolute exhaustion. She wiped the frost from her eyelashes with the back of her sleeve. When she pressed her ear against the newly armored exterior, she noticed something extraordinary. The biting, high-pitched whistle of the wind striking the bare wood had vanished. Instead, there was only a soft, diffused sigh. The dense fibers were already absorbing the kinetic energy of the air, breaking the wind's singular force into millions of harmless, tiny currents. But the true test, the deadly white hurricane of the north, was now only hours away. By dusk, the very atmosphere above the steppe began to compress. A violent, sudden drop in barometric pressure squeezed the frigid air, making every inhalation feel heavy, sharp, and metallic against the lungs. The leaden gray sky bruised into a terrifying, deep charcoal. There was no sunset to mark the end of the day, only a rapid, suffocating swallowing of the light. The wind had ceased its ominous hissing, replaced by a low, guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the freezing, rock-hard earth itself. The heavy wool of Clara's coat, stiffened by hours of frozen sweat, cracked softly with every movement. Her legs felt like solid blocks of lead as she dragged her heavy leather boots across the frozen yard for Phase 3 of her desperate fortifications. The vertical bundles of stalks were firmly in place, but stalks alone were not enough. In the brutal physics of a high-velocity blizzard, even a millimeter of exposed draft could act as an invisible blade, slicing through the precious warmth of the cabin. She needed an impenetrable, interlocking matrix. She needed the sunflower heads. Beside the wooden porch sat 3 massive burlap sacks, bulging with the heavy, decapitated heads of the giant sunflowers she had harvested weeks prior. Clara dragged the first sack toward the northern wall, the rough burlap scraping over the hoarfrost with a raspy, agonizing hiss. She plunged her bare hands, having discarded her cumbersome outer gloves, to regain a few precious ounces of dexterity into the icy sack. The texture of the dried flower heads was incredibly rough, each one a bristling disc of hardened black seeds backed by a thick, spongy pith. The sharp husks pricked at her numb fingertips like tiny iron needles. Her knuckles bled from the abrasive friction, bright red drops instantly crystallizing into frozen beads on her pale, waxy skin. With agonizing precision, she began cramming these massive, fibrous discs into the tight, triangular gaps between the bundles of stalks and the log walls. She wedged them in with all her remaining body weight, forcing the spongy backing of the flowers to compress and expand into the empty spaces. This meticulous packing was the secret to the aerodynamic boundary layer. The thick vertical stalks broke the wind's sheer, blunt force, but these dense, seed-packed heads created thousands of microscopic pockets of stagnant, dead air. And dead air is one of the greatest natural insulators on Earth. She moved methodically down the line, filling every crack, every seam, and every structural vulnerability of her home. When she reached the cabin's 2 small, fragile glass windows, her movement slowed. These were the fatal flaws of any homesteader's dwelling. Before she applied the padding, the thin glass panes were already humming a terrifying, high-pitched frequency under the escalating wind pressure. The men in the valley had boarded theirs up with thick, heavy oak planks and iron nails, plunging themselves into absolute darkness. Clara did not use wood. She carefully stacked the thickest, most densely packed sunflower heads directly against the exterior sills, building a thick, convex cushion around the glass. She left only a tiny, narrow slit near the top to let in the pale morning light, burying the rest of the brittle pane behind a foot of solid biological armor. The ambient temperature was now 30 degrees below zero and dropping with lethal speed. The moisture in her breath was freezing to the woolen fibers of her scarf, forming a heavy, suffocating crust of solid ice over her mouth and chin. Her core body temperature was dangerously low. Deep, uncontrollable shivers violently racked her spine, making her teeth chatter so hard her jaw ached. Every muscle fiber in her exhausted body screamed for the radiant warmth of the hearth. As she jammed the final dried flower head into the corner of the eastern eaves, the first true herald of the great blizzard arrived. It was not a gentle flurry of snow, but a solid, horizontal wall of razor-sharp ice crystals, blasting across the open steppe at 60 miles per hour. It struck Clara's back like a spray of shattered glass, nearly throwing her to her knees in the frozen dirt. The great storm was finally here. Clara crawled back inside her cabin on her hands and knees, dragging her frozen, trembling body across the threshold and slamming the heavy oak door shut against the mounting fury of the night. The heavy iron bolt slid into place with a dull, hollow thud. For a long, breathless minute, she simply lay on the cold floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The air inside the cabin was still, but it was dangerously cold, the raw breath of the approaching winter settling over the small room like a suffocating shroud. She forced herself to stand, her stiffened muscles cracking as she limped toward the hearth. Her hands, entirely numb and clumsy from the sub-zero air, fumbled with the flint and steel. Sparks showered onto the dry tinder, catching a tiny flame that she carefully, desperately fed with small twigs of resinous pine until a bright, snapping fire roared to life. Phase 4 of her survival plan was no longer about physical construction. It was the psychological waiting game, the terrifying endurance of the dark. As the fire grew, throwing long, flickering shadows against the timber walls, the full weight of the great blizzard of the steppe struck the homestead. The noise was deafening. It did not sound like wind anymore. It sounded like the screeching of an iron locomotive ripping directly through her yard. Outside, the visibility had dropped to absolute zero, a terrifying whiteout that erased the earth and sky. The wind pressure against the cabin was immense, a crushing force that made the thick pine rafters groan aloud. In the valley below, the neighboring homesteads were already beginning to suffer. The raw, unshielded force of the 100-mile-per-hour Arctic winds was slamming directly into their heavy log walls. The wind found every microscopic gap between their mortar, ripping the insulation from their joints and turning their sturdy homes into freezing, draft-filled iceboxes. But inside Clara's cabin, a strange, miraculous phenomenon was taking place. As she sat huddled near the hearth, wrapped in a thick patchwork quilt, she watched the western wall, the side taking the full, brutal brunt of the Arctic hurricane. The wood was not shaking. The terrifying, high-pitched whistle of wind slipping through the cracks never came. Instead, the wall emitted only a deep, muffled, rhythmic thrumming. The towering matrix of dried sunflower stalks was doing exactly what nature had designed it to do. As the horizontal torrents of ice crystals slammed into the biological mesh, they did not bounce off or shatter the wood. The millions of dense, interlocking cellulose fibers captured the snow. The rough, seed-heavy heads acted like tiny, jagged hooks, trapping the flying white powder and holding it fast against the cabin's exterior. Hour after hour, the blizzard fed the trap Clara had engineered. The snow was no longer just drifting around the house. It was actively adhering to the sunflower shield, weaving itself into a solid, massive jacket of dense, hard-packed white. By midnight, the layers of trapped snow had grown to over 3 feet thick, entirely enveloping the western and northern walls. The primitive physics of the steppe were now in full effect. The kinetic energy of the howling gale was completely broken by the outer stalks, while the deep inner layer of trapped static snow formed a perfect, natural vacuum of insulation. The freezing air could no longer touch the wood of the cabin. The rising warmth from Clara's small hearth, instead of radiating out into the freezing night, was trapped inside pockets of dead air, bouncing back into the small room. She watched in awe as the frost on the inside of the logs slowly began to melt, turning into tiny, glistening tears of water that rolled harmlessly down the wood. Her crazy project was standing firm against the deadliest storm in history. By the second day, the great blizzard had reached its terrifying apex. The open steppe was no longer a landscape. It was a white abyss of pure, screaming violence. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to a catastrophic 40 degrees below zero, a threshold where exposed flesh freezes solid in under 60 seconds, and the lungs fill with blood if one attempts to draw a deep, unprotected breath. In the valley below, the tragedy was unfolding exactly as Clara had feared. The conventional, heavy timber homesteads of the neighboring men were failing one by one. The sheer, unyielding kinetic energy of the gale had stripped the dried mud and moss mortar straight from the joints of their sturdy log cabins. The wind had forced its way inside, blowing out fires and dropping interior temperatures to near-fatal levels. The homesteaders huddled together in the pitch black, their hands turning blue as they burned their own furniture just to stay alive, listening to the terrifying sound of their windows shattering under the immense air pressure. But high on the ridge, Clara's cabin stood in absolute, miraculous silence. The violent roar of the storm had been reduced to a distant, muffled whisper. Inside, the air was not freezing. It was astonishingly warm, holding a steady, comfortable temperature that allowed her to shed her heavy woolen shawl. The rustic physics of her ancient method had achieved what hundreds of pounds of oak and iron nails could not. The secret lay in the brilliant engineering of the boundary layer. When a 100-mile-per-hour Arctic wind strikes a flat, hard surface like a standard log wall, it creates a massive pressure differential. The air accelerates, searching for the smallest micro-fissure to penetrate. But Clara's sunflower shield did not present a flat surface. The millions of dense, grooved vertical stalks acted as an aerodynamic buffer, breaking the singular, crushing fist of the wind and scattering it into countless, microscopic currents that lost all their destructive momentum. More importantly, the high fiber density and immense tensile strength of the dried stems had created a permanent, biological trap for the snow itself. Instead of allowing the drifts to pile dangerously against the structure and crush the roof, the sunflower mesh had caught the initial flurries, binding them to the walls like a second skin. This trapped, static layer of snow had now frozen solid into a massive, 4-foot-thick dome of dense white armor. In the realm of physics, static snow is an incredible thermal barrier, composed of 90% trapped, unmoving air. The lethal Arctic gale was blowing furiously over the cabin, gliding seamlessly along the smooth, aerodynamic contours of the snow dome, never touching the structure itself. The rising warmth from Clara's small hearth was entirely insulated, captured within the microscopic honeycomb cells of the sunflower pith and the dead air spaces of the snow jacket. The cabin had become a living thermos, maintaining its own life-saving ecosystem in the dead center of a frozen hell. Through the tiny, narrow slit she had left at the top of her padded window, Clara looked out into the blinding white chaos. She could see the dark, distant shapes of the settlement below, completely buried, their chimneys dark and lifeless. Her windows, cushioned by a thick, flexible mattress of spongy flower heads, had not vibrated once. The glass was perfectly intact, safe from the shattering pressure that had ruined her neighbors. They had ridiculed the young widow. They had laughed at her gardening and mocked her reliance on dead, brittle flowers instead of raw, masculine muscle. But as the storm raged on, unable to pierce her humble defense, Clara knew she had won. She had not fought the brutal nature of the steppe with brute force. She had partnered with it, using the brilliant, forgotten design of the earth itself to build an impenetrable fortress out of nothing but sunshine and fiber. On the fourth morning, the great beast finally died. The roaring winds that had terrorized the steppe for nearly 100 hours surrendered to an absolute, ringing silence. Clara pushed open her heavy oak door, forcing her way through the remaining drift of white powder to step out onto the pristine, glistening landscape. The sun rose into a crystal-clear, brilliant blue sky, its cold light turning the vast expanses of snow into a blinding sea of diamonds. The open plains were unrecognizable, reshaped into massive, rolling white dunes. Her cabin stood proudly on the ridge, still encased in its thick, protective cocoon of hardened white armor, the pale, frozen tops of the sunflower stalks peeking out from the drifts like standard-bearers of a victorious army. She had survived without losing a single pane of glass, her home remaining warm and secure through the deadliest blizzard in memory. Down in the valley, the smoke was only just beginning to rise again from the half-buried homesteads. The neighboring men emerged from their icy dwellings, pale, exhausted, and shivering from the days of terror. As they looked up toward the ridge, their eyes widened in profound astonishment. They expected to find the young widow's cabin collapsed, its fragile windows shattered, and its occupant frozen to death. Instead, they saw a pristine dome of survival. They walked up the ridge in silence, their heavy boots sinking into the deep snow, their previous mockery completely replaced by a solemn, humbled awe. They stood before the wall of dried stalks, running their calloused hands over the frozen biological mesh that had broken the back of a 100-mile-per-hour Arctic storm. In that quiet morning, they realized the profound truth. The ancient intelligence of the earth would always outlast the raw, unthinking force of muscle and iron. Clara's triumph was not achieved through advanced machinery or expensive materials, but through a deep, intuitive understanding of the primitive physics hidden within the natural world. Our ancestors did not conquer nature. They listened to it. They observed the density of a stem, the resilience of a fiber, and the insulating power of dead air, weaving these simple observations into brilliant, life-saving strategies that kept humanity alive through the harshest eras of our history. There are countless secrets like Clara's windbreak shield buried under the dust of time-forgotten methods of survival, ancient engineering, and rustic sciences waiting to be rediscovered. If you possess the desire to look beyond the modern world and uncover the profound, hidden wisdom of those who came before us, take a moment to subscribe. Join us as we journey back into the forgotten corners of history, where the greatest shield against adversity was often nothing more than the quiet brilliance of the human mind.